and then use that to think about Chinese globalization, and then come back at the end to think about, well, are there ways in which the future of Chinese globalization should, in some sense, do the sorts of things that the US has done in globalization, whether for good or for bad. I'm especially grateful to have the opportunity to speak here ahead of tomorrow's US-China meeting, the Diplomatic and Security Dialogue. And I'll be very interested to hear the second panel on the diplomatic and security issues as well. So when I think of US globalization, I think of the positive and the negative. And so the positive, much of which Jim Doran has just mentioned, the positive clearly, as Jim said, is the open flows of capital in both directions, right? Mostly free flows of capital, both in and out. And of course, we all understand that sometimes poses challenges, right? Capital flow can be volatile in the US and in Asia and other places, but for the most part, I think that's a positive. Right, so I put that as a positive. Again, as Jim said, the free flow of ideas is a strong characteristic of US globalization, and I think it's a very positive one. The rule-based system, another one. I would add then that the US globalization characteristic, a characteristic of US globalization is that the US system is responsive to a degree, and maybe with some delay, to political concerns or to social concerns. Obviously, we're seeing now what seems to be a big correction in the US, perhaps of ignoring concerns that were really important to much of the country, and that we're seeing. And actually, since we're standing here at Heritage, obviously Heritage has been a big part of that, of the intellectual development of the ideas involved with this correction. Okay, so I could go on and talk more about the US characteristics of globalization, but I'm going to start to sound like the Washington Consensus, or even worse, a Tom Friedman book or something. So I better stop before I get too trite. Okay, but those are the good aspects of US globalization. Some bad aspects of US globalization, and of course these are not going to be entirely bad, but some things that people, maybe especially outside the US, look at as bad, would be the low saving rate in the US, right? Which means that the US, I guess to put it bluntly, sucks in foreign capital, right? There's the prodigious saving from the rest of the world comes into the US, is invested in the US. So some people around the world would say, well, look, there's so many needs in other countries. Why is capital flowing from developing countries into the US, which is already a wealthy country? So that's a characteristic of globalization in the US that perhaps some people would say is a bad or negative. A second one would be that the US is an attractive destination for immigrants, right? For immigrants from other countries coming to the US, and there's the phenomenon of so-called brain drain. And we all see this, right? I teach at the University of Maryland, and we have incredible students from China and from other countries. And then third, I don't want to say too much bad about the US, but the third is the US culture in some ways in other countries can be seen as dominating or crowding out the local culture. And by culture, I don't mean necessarily democracy, which I would see as a positive to the extent that spreads in other countries, but things like US movies, US music, and so on. So that'll be interesting. Actually, I just learned at breakfast, right, that China's opening up its motion picture sector further to U.S. movies. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in China. Okay, so those are just a couple of things on the U.S. side. That would be the so-called bad side of U.S. globalization. I know they're all voluntary, right? So no one's forcing capital to come to the U.S. and so on. These things are all voluntary. Okay, so that's the U.S. Okay, so some good, some bad. So in China, when I look at China, some of the good aspects of globalization in China, or the Chinese characteristics of globalization, one would be the high saving rate, right? So just the opposite of the US, where the high saving rate in China provides capital for China's development, but also for development in the rest of the world. And we just heard about that with the Belt and Road, the capital for the rest of the world. Number two, of course, is over the last several decades as a low-cost platform, especially for manufacturing, but increasingly for other activities as well. And I would say that improves productivity in other countries. It holds down global inflation. It drives down costs. to some extent, it spreads innovation and so on. And then the last aspect of Chinese globalization that I'll highlight is there's a sense in which China just, well, to put it simply, gets stuff done. Right? It's most obvious in infrastructure. Right? When China sets out to do something, it gets done. Right? And whether it's always a good thing is one could question, but that's an aspect of globalization that I think on the whole is probably a good one. Okay. So then number two, of course, on the bad, and what's striking to me is that when I think of Chinese globalization on the bad side, they're the same in some ways as on the good side. So one is a high saving rate. I say that's a positive for China, but on the other hand, that means that China doesn't contribute as much as it could, or probably should, to global demand. The low-cost manufacturing platform combined with trade rules contributes to trade tensions. The flip side of driving down costs could be some copying and lack of legal protections, right? So there's a fine line between innovation and unfair or illegal copying. And that's an aspect of globalization that in some ways has been bad. And then, of course, the last one, the get stuff done, we see sometimes as a bad thing. And that's, I think, in the South China Seas, that's kind of the one place to highlight that. And I'm sure that'll be talked about in the next session. Okay, so those are some good and bad aspects of globalization. Let me look forward just for a few minutes and think about how globalization will change and how China's role in globalization will change. And it seems to me the number one aspect is that China will move from being a source of stability, a source of global stability, to a source of adjustment. And as Justin said, we saw the Chinese role in stability in two ways, or in two global financial episodes. One is in the late 90s, when China was an incredibly important contributor to global financial stability, especially by not engaging in a devaluation at the time, even when all of its trading partners and neighbors were devaluing the currencies. And then, of course, in the 2008 financial crisis, that was an important part of global stability, was China's positive role then. I was at the U.S. Treasury then. I know we all very much appreciated China's positive role then. So that was then as the source of stability. But in the future, I think the source of adjustment will be more important. And obviously, the U.S. and Europe need sources of external demand. Sources of external demand would be important for other countries as well, developing countries. And it seems like that's an important role for China to play. And this flexibility, obviously on the currency side, on the capital flow side, closely related, on investment, on trade, and all the things that Jim just highlighted. So I won't go through his whole list. I think all this is happening, and there's a sense in which the good is that the steps that are needed, the two sides, the U.S. and China, I think are broadly on the same page, and the disagreements are about the speed at which the adjustment is taking place. So I just want to raise a question, and maybe this is something that the Institute in Beijing can consider, that when looking at China, there's this consensus that going slowly is always the right way, or what's the saying is, right, crossing the river on the stones, stepping on the stones. And I just wonder if it's worthwhile to look back at the experience of countries that have gone quickly. I don't necessarily mean the whole Jeff Sachs, retrospective of Eastern Europe, but just to say whether the cost of moving quickly on reform is always as high. In this sense, I wonder if the experience of Eastern Europe and the political upheaval that came with the rapid changes in Eastern Europe in the shift from central planning to the market, if those were specific to Eastern Europe and would necessarily be seen in China with rapid movement. So I think that's a question for China. Okay, let me finish with two last thoughts. So I want to come back to my list for the U.S. and think about what applies for China. And I think actually what struck me was that both the list of good globalization and bad globalization both apply for China. So my good list, I'm not going to ask you to remember but my list of 4 things from the beginning. I'm sure you all do. But no, my list was open capital flows. Obviously, China's moving in that direction. Rules and stability, and obviously Jim talked about that as well. The free movement of ideas, and in some sense that will be increasingly important for China to move from development of hardware to software. And then the responsiveness to political and social concerns, and not just local ones, but global ones as well. So that's the good U.S. characteristics. And what was striking to me then is the bad, what I said is sometimes thought of as the bad aspects of U.S. globalization might actually be good ones for China. So one is the low U.S. saving rate. So I'd say the U.S. has to save more, right, both at the public sector and the private sector. But China is probably the opposite, right? Lower saving in China would probably be a good thing for China and good thing for the world. So there's a sense in which embracing the U.S. Negative might be a positive for China. If China were a more attractive place for immigration, if there were brain drain from other countries going to China, it seems like that would really be also a good thing. In some sense, demonstrate that China has made this adjustment into globalization. And then the last thing is the U.S. culture. I said the U.S. culture can be a negative in other countries, and it seems like there's a lot of scope for Chinese culture to be a positive in other countries. The idea of saving for the future, the importance of family, social stability. It seems like there's a lot of contribution there as well. So why don't I stop there?
Great. Thank you, Phil. Appreciate that. Dr. Wen. Dr. Wen is Assistant Vice President of the Federal Reserve Bank in St. Louis.
Good morning. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity and also to comment on the earlier excellent speeches. So basically, I want to mention several points. Number one is that the rise of China has been very puzzling. Because the existing economic theories or political theories seems hard to explain how come China has been growing so fast and continue to grow and will soon become the #1 economy in terms of GDP. So for example, most of the existing wisdoms think of institutions as the prerequisite or fundamental precondition for economic growth. We talk about the legal system, transparency of law, and private property protection, and free market system. If we measure economy's potential of growth by that kind of institutional view, then China would have never emerged, and then along keep growing very fast. Or we would constantly predict China's collapse. Indeed, many people have constantly predicting China's collapse repeatedly, but so far China has not collapsed. So therefore, that view, there's something missing in that view. On the other hand, people say, well, China is not exactly like a completely lack of market, a complete lack of property right. And in fact, perhaps one of the key important elements for China's emerge or rapid growth is China adopted the market system after 1978 reform. Well, if we think in that way, then there's a lot of counterexamples. For example, we have Philippines, which perhaps embraced the market system much longer than China. How come we did not see such rapid growth in Philippines? And we have Latin American countries which have adopted private property rights, perhaps more thoroughly, and still we do not see such a rapid dynamic growth. And also, after economic political reform in Russia and Ukraine, many East European countries, they embraced market system, private property right more thoroughly than China, and we did not see such dynamic rapid growth. So in either way, the existing wisdoms need to be challenged. And so what is the correct theory then? We need a new theory. Professor Jocelyn just provided a profound way to rethink about China and economic growth. Now let me go back to actually Adam Smith, the founding father of modern economic theory. Today in our textbook, when we talk about Adam Smith, we talk about an invisible hand. I think that's very misleading. If we go back to Adam Smith reading his original book, you will find he seldom mentioned invisible hand. Somewhere here or there he did, but did not occupy the most important space of his volume. One of the most important things he constantly emphasized, and followed by many other philosophers after him, is that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. Division of labor was most important discovery of Adam Smith, and that means social coordination, but the degree of that is limited by the extent of the market. Okay, so therefore we have to talk about market. Where does market come from? What determines the market size? In the past several thousand years, I think human race here or there have experienced maybe around 3 waves of industrialization. The first wave started in Europe after Renaissance, was I call it proto-industrialization, features massive amount of rural industries, small-scale craftsmanship enterprises in countryside, in Europe, in UK, in France, in Netherlands. But the reason that wave arose precisely because of monarchies in European countries created a global market for those tiny enterprises through colonization, through imperialism, through slave trade. Without such a global market creation, it was impossible to support that degree of division of labor. And Adam Smith himself mentioned that the reason commerce first emerged in any human society was because there was God-created market by creating rivers. All civilization emerged along rivers. Without rivers, it was impossible to emerge trade. Without trade, you cannot support division of labor. But those are natural market created by God. If you want to lift the economy to the second wave of industrialization, you need man-made infrastructure. That was canal system. So Netherlands, UK, and the US, under the help of government, create massive amount of sophisticated canal system, support the first industrial revolution, which features manually mass-produced textile goods. Then you follow second wave of industrialization based on railroad, new type of infrastructure, and today we see high-speed trains created in China. So in every stage of development, you need to create market. Market does not exist by itself, it does not fall from the sky. It is a public goods, which has 3 pillars, fundamental pillars: political stability, social trust, and infrastructure. Who can provide those pillars? The state. That's why the UK kick-started industrial revolution, not the other European countries or China or India, because the UK was the first nation state, had the state capacity to create a market for its merchants and enterprises. So I think this having this view of the nature of market is very important. It's a public good. It has to be created by state. Secondly, economy evolve through different stages. Doesn't matter how late you started your industrialization process. Even if UK started 250 years ago, you cannot just directly jump into heavy industry like the UK has later on. UK has gone through 5 stages of economic development. Also France, also Germany, also US, also Japan, also today's China. First stage, as I mentioned earlier, after the agricultural civilization was proto-industrialization. And even at that primitive level, you need a global market already. And individual peasants could not create a global market by themselves. You need state involvement. The second stage is first industrial revolution, which features using manually created machines to mass produce final consumer goods, mostly textile goods, light consumer goods. Then the third stage is called, I call industrial trinity boom. Basically, energy and motive power and transport infrastructure. And every nation which has successfully kick-started or emulated the first industrial revolution, you would have tremendous demand for trade for cargoes. So primitive road ride by horses are no longer sufficient. You need to create new form of roads, and you need a new form of locomotive power to drive it, and a new form of energy to provide the power. So that's the third stage. And through that stage, you naturally kickstart the second industrial revolution, which features the mass production of the means of mass production. All the intermediate goods, including infrastructures, steels, machineries, are produced massively by machines. Use machines to produce machines. Only after you finish the second industrial revolution, the productivity of labor of the society is so high so that we can afford welfare state. Then we provide people with unemployment insurance, with lots of social safety net, with lots of other free education and free Medicare. So this is the economic aspect of social welfare. Also, there's a political aspect of social welfare, which is individual rights and universal suffrage, for example. So you look at the history of every successfully industrialized nation. They have gone through the 5 stages step by step. No country jumped to the last stage in the beginning. You could have ideas about human rights, but it's not implementable. You look at the US. US finished the so-called rural industrialization by about 1820. Then kick-started the first industrialization by mimicking or emulating UK technology, and finished the first industrial revolution around Civil War. And during that entire process, there was very little human rights in the US. How about the rights of Indians, the rights of their land, the rights of black slaves? Then the US through a wave of industrial trinity boom, railroad boom, steam engine, and the cross-Pacific railroad building up kick-started the second industrial revolution. So it was during the second industrial revolution the US surpassed the UK because US had created a much larger market than UK, not because the US had a better institution than UK. And during the second industrial revolution, US became the leader of the world. For example, by 1985, US became the largest manufacturing powerhouse in the world. But by that time, US universal education was very backward. No professor in the US could publish good article in European journals because academic research lagged behind. The frontier of discovery is manufacturing. Without manufacturing, you cannot really make a technology discoveries. And also, by 1920, the US still had 50% of the population living in the rural areas. So agricultural modernization come even later because modernization of agriculture is very capital intensive. You have to wait until you start it or nearly finish second industrial revolution, which is a heavy industrialization. Then around 1940, US finished second industrial revolution, become so affluent and productive that US was ready to enter welfare state. But even that, you need the societal movement to push that. So in the 1960s, lots of civil rights movement, and black people eventually got their voice after 100 years of civil war to get their right to vote. And in 1994, US passed a law against violence against women, passed a law. And by 2001, the US Indian Bureau openly acknowledged in the history so-called conflict against India is massacre. So those kind of development, including human rights, legal system, goes through by stages, follows evolutionary process. It's impossible to, in the beginning, to design so-called transparent modern system to kickstart industrialization. You look at the UK, by 1830, already finished the first industrial revolution. 80% of private prosecution were carried out by victims, not through the legal system, because the legal system was so backward and so expensive. Okay, so therefore, let me just summarize my viewpoint. First of all, we need to rethink about modern economic theory in terms using China, for example, as an example, using history of the West example. Think about what is the market? It's a public goods. And what is the sequential stage of development? And those are important issues. Also, let me just say one more point before I finish. But we need to look at the future U.S.-China relationship. Ever since 15th century, the global development has been driven by spirit of commerce, the so-called capitalism. Capitalism is a modern force of civilization because it encourages commerce, and we do commerce by shaking hands, even though that time the means of that is colonialism. But anyway, regardless of culture, regardless of religion, regardless of national boundaries, we do business. Then after World War, U.S. became the leading champion of globalization, global business, and the U.S. helped rebuild Germany, rebuild Japan, and provided funding for lots of developing countries. And today, China, because of its larger size, China is carrying the U.S. banner forward, promoting global trade, promoting further globalization, and creating a deeper, larger global market through the One Belt, One Road system. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.